Working Man Investor. Today's video is going to be on the Smoot-Hawly Tariff Act of 1930. It's important to understand this because we hear tariffs in the news every night now, and while history doesn't always repeat, it often rhymes. The Smoot-Hawly Act was sponsored by Willis Hawley, a Republican from Oregon who served in the House of Representatives, and Reed Smoot, who was a Republican senator from Utah. The act raised tariffs on imports with the goal of protecting American jobs and farmers. The 1920s were a very difficult time for farmers. Foreign demand for agriculture soared during the boom years of World War I, and prices of farms between 1915 and 1918 skyrocketed. This sparked a wave of land speculations and large investments in machinery by farmers to increase their capacity. This also pushed farm indebtedness to record levels. When a tightening of monetary and credit conditions led to a collapse of the commodity prices, indebted farmers felt the squeeze financially. As agriculture remained in a prolonged slump, the burden of mortgage rates rising and their product that the farmers producing remaining low forced multiple farms into failure. This was a real problem because at this time, 25% of our workforce was in agriculture. So with this, Congress felt the need to try to do something, so thus the Smoot-Hawly Tariff Act went into discussion. However, there was a serious problem with tariffs, and that was that the United States was a net exporter of crops to the world. We produced more crops in agriculture for export than we did for our own people. And the price for these commodities are set by the global economy, what other countries are willing to pay for what we're producing. So slapping tariffs on the little bit of agriculture that comes into our country isn't going to help the price that the farmers can get in the global market. And they discussed multiple different ideas, some of which being tariffing tropical fruits such as bananas that we didn't really produce here to block them completely from coming into this country. The thought process was that American citizens would substitute for these fruits for, say, pears and apples, things domestically made, thus raising the demand and raising prices. However, that never really came to fruition, and it really was never realistic either. So as this went on, farmers began to push hard for subsidies, but the American politicians really weren't interested in subsidizing farms, and it really appeared to a lot of people that they were more interested in giving off the impression that they cared about the farmers than what to help them deal with the real problem, which was being debt saturated. So while Congress debated the Smoot-Hawly Tariff Act, the stock market crash of 1929 happened. Now, this didn't cause the Great Depression, but it did force us into a very deep recession. And there's a lot of, if you look back through history, a lot of debate on whether or not the Smoot-Hawly Tariff Act being discussed in Congress is actually caused the panic in the stock market and the sell-off. I don't believe that to be true. There is no evidence that the Smoot-Hawly Act contributed to the stock market crash. If tariffs were such an important factor in the stock market, firms affected by trade would have moved differently from other industries within the market, and this did not happen. So, for example, our stocks for petroleum and automobiles and packing houses, all those would have absolutely crashed if this was related to Smoot-Hawly. And all of those stocks fell about the same as the average market. What really caused the stock market crash of 1929 was the utilities companies were really acceptable to any type of regulating, and they were investment trusts had highly leveraged themselves and bought the utility stocks on margin. So when the regulation came through, or even talks of regulating the utility companies came through, it forced these heavily margined companies to begin to sell. This set off a panic. And so if you go back and you study the stock market and you really break it down, you'll see that any of these export-oriented stock companies that Smoot-Hawly would have been discussed, but like I said, petroleum, automobiles, packing houses, if this was the deal, those stocks, individual stocks, would have absolutely crashed just like the utility companies did. They didn't. They fell about the same average as the rest of the stock market. So on January of 1930, the Senate continued to consider the Smoot-Hawly Act Economists argued American manufacturing did not need greater tariff protection, and the American citizens were supplied with 96% of the manufactured goods that were manufactured by the United States, and that our companies depended on foreign countries to absorb our excess. So basically what the economists were saying is 96% of what people use in the United States during 1930 was produced here in the United States. These manufacturers in the United States were not facing heavy imports and competition from foreign manufacturing. And in fact, they depended on foreign manufacturing to absorb the excess stuff that the American consumer was not taking. So these economists were warning that if we tariff, these other countries might tariff, and then our corporations, our manufacturers, are not going to have the ability to sell the excess globally in the global economy. And in fact, in that point, here's some statistics for you. The nation produced $47 billion in manufacturing goods, but we only imported $854 million. So we produced $47 billion, only brought in $854 million. That right there shows that we have no need to tariff. So the American manufacturers, like I said, were more dependent on exporting to foreign markets than they were to importing. And in 1929, the United States enjoyed a $1.4 billion trade surplus in manufacturing goods. So the real problem, as I've discussed earlier, food exports had been falling, and there was a trade deficit. But the approximate values of food imports only amounted to half of the value of manufactured goods. So all this problem was in farming. It was not in manufacturing. So bank executives reminded President Hoover the United States is a creditor nation, and after World War I, and high tariffs could prevent countries from earning dollars to pay back their war debts. So basically what this meant, and this did contribute to World War II, is other countries had only one way to get the dollar. Can't produce it their own way. The only way to do it is to make stuff and sell it to the United States, export it to the United States. We import it, we pay for it in dollars. These other countries would take these dollars in and then use it to pay off their war debts. If we tariffed and cut them off from the dollar, it could cause real problems, which it did. And then Henry Ford also advised Hoover that the Smoot-Hawly Act was economic stupidity. As you can imagine, Henry Ford had a lot to lose by tariffs. He was one of the main manufacturers that was exporting his Model T, I believe it was still the Model T in 1930, to the world. However, on June 17, 1930, the Smoot-Hawly Act was signed into law by President Herbert Hoover. The act increased import duties by an average of 40% to 60%. The tariffs were for both agriculture imports and more than 20,000 other imports. This was done, as I've said earlier, as a plan to protect jobs. Hoover signed this law despite 1,000 economists begging him to veto it. Walter Lippmann, the country's premier columnist at the time, called the Smoot-Hawly Act wretched, mischievous product of stupidity and greed. Smoot-Hawly was originally designed to protect farmers, as I said. However, once the bill went to Congress, politics took over. So what I mean by that is that politicians would agree, yeah, we'll back this Smoot-Hawly Act for agriculture, but we have this manufacturing in our district, so why don't you just go ahead and put this in there too, and then you have our vote. But if you do not put our manufacturing within our district into this Smoot-Hawly Tariff Act, then no, we're not going to vote for it. This went on to the whole country. And by jurisdiction, they just kept adding more. This is part of the reason why it became so massive. So by the time it was passed, it was this ridiculously massive bill covering much more than the original agriculture bill it was intended to. And what made things so much worse is this bill was passed during the Great Depression. So the Smoot-Hawly Act had a massive effect on the economy. And as I'll go through here, I firmly believe, while it did not cause the Great Depression, it made it worse. And I definitely believe that it played a role in making it longer. So the Smoot-Hawly Act accounted for a 13% decline on imports from 1930 to 33. Although this is significant, it was not responsible for the entire collapse of imports. Much of the decline, about 2/3, was a result of a decline in demand resulting from falling income. Now that makes total sense. We're in the Great Depression now. During the high point of the Great Depression, 25% of our population was not working. When you're not working, you're not spending. Because of that, demand is lower, so you're not importing as much, you're not bringing as much, and you're not producing as much domestically because there's no demand. However, because a reduction in one country's imports amounted to a reduction in another country's exports, higher trade barriers became known as the beggar thy neighbor policy. The result was a destruction of trade to which no one was better off. So the Smoot-Hawly Act played a major role in the spread of discriminatory trade policies and resentment of the United States tariff. The United States became a target for discriminatory policies and tariffs from other countries, and they didn't often call it tariffs, but it was. So the most damning of these discriminating policies was by Britain. Britain set up their own trade bloc with Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and India. The trading bloc cost the United States between 75 and 200 million of lost exports, which is about 15 to 13% of our exports. 5 to 13% of our exports we lost. So now think about this. We have the Great Depression going on. As I've already said, at its height, a quarter of our population was out of work. We're not able to produce enough because people don't have money to buy. We need other markets to sell in. We need the global economy to end the Great Depression. This is how we could have ended it earlier. If we didn't pass the Smoot-Hawly Tariff Act, other countries wouldn't probably have tariffed as bad, if at all, and we could have produced more and sold more to the global economy. As we're selling to other countries, what are we doing? We're hiring people. Maybe we're adding second shifts. We're building more. We're bringing more jobs. As these people are working, they're beginning to spend more. And I'll get into that. So I want to finish up this part, though, just discussing about how it cut back on our exporting ability and our trading and our loss in revenue. So Secretary of State Cordell Hull said, "The greatest injury in a commercial way that has been inflicted on this country since I have been in public life was the great increase in the British Empire preference that followed the Smoot-Hawly tariff. That was an act of retaliation." Okay, so furthermore, it wasn't just Britain and her allies that retaliated against the United States over Smoot-Hawly. Germany, along with Eastern Europe, formed their own trade bloc that excluded the United States. Germany's imports from the United States fell from 15% in 1928 to 6% in 1935. So over that 7-year span, and 5 years of it were in the Great Depression, Germany has cut their imports from the United States by 9%. One country alone. Imagine all the stuff we could have been producing and selling to them, which could have, again, created jobs. And also, it wasn't just Germany. France joined this practice too. And during the same time period, France's imports fell a little bit less. They fell from 12% in 1928 to 9% in 1935, but still 3%. When you're in a depression, every percent matters. So while the overall world imports did fall from 1929 to 1932, imports from the United States declined at a much greater extent. That makes sense that countries are not going to be importing from the United States. They're not going to be buying our stuff because they're angry. They're setting up other trade blocs. So world imports fell from 25% from 1929 to 1932. Well, part of that's from the Smoot-Hawly, but it's also the Great Depression, loss of income, people not spending. World imports fell 25% from 1929 from 1932. In that same time period, imports from the United States fell 49%. 49% people stopped importing from the United States. The United States was cut out of a substantial part of world trade during 1930. That cost a massive loss in commercial opportunities. Think of everything that we lost, all the new money that could have been coming into our system, the new jobs that could have been created was lost because of this. So due to the Smoot-Hawly, other countries retaliated against the United States, and as I've said, they formed other trade blocs. This caused exports to fall more than imports. Think about that now. We passed the Smoot-Hawly Act in 1930 to stop imports. We wanted to block imports, and the complete opposite actually happened. This caused exports to fall more than imports. So we were importing more than we were exporting because of the Smoot-Hawly tariff. And I keep saying this, but during the Great Depression, when we needed other markets to sell our product to create jobs, we blocked ourselves off from that. So because of this, it can be said that the Smoot-Hawly made the Great Depression for the United States much worse. So before the Smoot-Hawly Tariff Act, the American manufacturers, obviously, they depended on foreign countries to take our excess goods. Once we tariffed and other countries countered, the number of exports plummeted. Due to this, we had fewer products, fewer people buying our products. So because of that, we were producing less. When you produce less, what happens? We're not selling to the global economy anymore, to the rest of the world, or not as much. So we're not producing as much. So you start cutting jobs. And it isn't just you're cutting jobs in factories. You're going from 3 shifts to 1 shift or closing. It's these factory workers are now out of work. One person's spending is another person's income. So these factory workers have all lost their job. They're not working. They're struggling. They're not going and hitting the taverns. They're not going out to eat. They're not doing whatever luxury items they're not buying. They're just trying to survive. So because of this, now all the restaurants are shutting down, and it's just a mess. So all of this just spiraled out of control, and the Great Depression just continued. Now, I do also want to point out that while the Smoot-Hawly Act did make the Great Depression worse, it did not cause the Great Depression, as I've said, and that there were several other factors that made the Great Depression worse. So from 1929 to 1932, the Federal Reserve did allow the money supply to drop by 1/3. This led to severe deflation. Consumer prices fell 25%. The deflationary environment caused real interest rates to go up. This killed businesses because when interest rates go up, all interest rates are is the cost of money. If you're going to borrow money, how much is it going to cost you? The interest rate will tell you. So when interest rates are high, it greatly discourages businesses from borrowing money to invest into their factories, which then creates jobs. You want low interest rates to stimulate the economy. But because of a deflationary environment, interest rates went up. So the ratio of debt to service to national income rose from 9% in 29 to 20% in 1932. That's according to Ben Bernanke. So this led to a financial distress among those who had borrowed money and the increase in non-performing loans. So basically interest rates went up and people couldn't afford to pay them back, and this caused distress within the banks because now these loans aren't performing. The banks aren't getting their principal back with interest, so they're not getting any money back. So now they're done loaning. They're not giving out loans. So now you got a credit problem, credit crisis. And the inevitable result of this is banks began to fail. This, like I said, this greatly disrupted credit markets, but it also led to large withdrawals. This is the bank runs we all studied about in like elementary school of people running into the banks trying to withdraw the money. And this was at a time long before FDIC insurance. So if you went to the bank and they didn't have it because of fractional lending, you give them $100 and they loan out 90 and keep 10, they don't have the money. So you lose your whole life savings. You lose everything. So that was another problem that obviously elongated the Great Depression, made it last longer. However, I think the biggest blow to the economy during the Great Depression was when the decision from the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates sharply in October of 1931. at a time when the economy was already weak. It was a devastating blow. Most economists believe if the Fed would have taken more aggressive action to stop bank failures and counteract the decline in the money supply, the Great Depression could have been avoided or at least not lasted as long. Here again, when they raised interest rates in 1931, when the economy is weak, you want a lower interest rate because this encourages borrowing. Businesses will go on and borrow money because interest rates are lower, hopefully invest it into their factories and then hire people. People get to go to work, and then what do? They spend money. They spend money in places that creates jobs, and then those people, they go and they spend money, which create more jobs. So when you raise the interest rate, you raise the cost of money, it just shut everything down, and then you had all these other factors that went into it. So these were the greatest factors of the Great Depression. What I want you to get out of this is I want you to understand the damage the Smoot-Hawly did to global trade and the opportunities that the United States lost played a major role in expanding the Great Depression. So today, obviously, we have President Trump talking about tariffs. As of the making of this video here in March, he's supposed to announce automobile tariffs. His tariffs are not going to cause a Great Depression. I don't believe we don't have anywhere near the same factors. But if he does go through with them, which I don't think he will, I think it's just a bargaining chip. I think it's just a big stick he's swinging at other countries to try to get him to do whatever it is he wants, whether it's reshore some things, which is a whole nother video because I don't think reshoring is going to work of a lot of things. But I think he's using them for it. But if he does go through, do massive tariffs, even if it's just automobiles like he's saying, plan on your cost of cars to become more expensive, and cars are already expensive. Car payments are already ridiculous. I read today the average car payment for a new car payment is $742. So let's just say, and I'll end this video here because I'm getting off topic, but let's say that he is going to tariff automobiles 25%, so we have to produce them here. It is a misnomer that, say, Hyundai is going to close their Mexico plant and build one here in the United States and produce millions of Hondas to sell in the global economy. That is not what's going to happen. They're going to keep their Mexico plant open because it has very low labor costs, because Mexico's standard of living is not high as the United States. They can pay their workers less because they need less to survive. Because of that, because your cost of production is lower, you're going to manufacture the vehicles cheaper. You can then sell them cheaper to the global economy. So the Mexico plants are going to continue to be the manufacturing hubs of the world. Best case scenario is you open a Hyundai plant here in the United States. Yeah, you might hire 1,500 workers, but if you're producing your vehicles here with high standards of living, our workers are going to want $15-20 an hour. They're going to need some kind of insurance, a 401k, sick days, vacations, things like that. The vehicles are going to be more expensive to produce. So therefore, they'll make them in this country to sell to us at an inflated rate to make up for their inflated labor costs. They will not produce millions and sell to the global economy because they can't compete, because it costs too much to make them here because of our labor. So that's just a little food for thought to end this talk of tariffs and the Smoot-Hawly Act. That's what I got for you today. Working man investor. Keep grinding, people.